And the topic of today's lecture is stakeholder management. So project stakeholder management is the name of the knowledge area which we are considering today. Technically it's the 10th knowledge area, but we're considering it at the moment because the processes within this knowledge area are done at the initiating stage. So there are two processes within the initiating stage for each project, and some dealing with stakeholders is one of those processes. So that's why we're doing this. That's why we're doing this today. I suppose it's important that we understand the purposes of this knowledge area and the processes involved. So the key thing and the most important thing is to identify the people who may or may not have impact the project or may be impacted by the project. We also are going to figure out um, what's their relationship to the project, their expectations, their ambitions, their requirements, and so on. And we're going to prioritize them based on their ability to influence project outcomes. And once we do that, we're going to be able to come up with a meaningful way of engaging with the stakeholders so that they contribute to us achieving the desired project objectives. So starting, suppose, sorry, 1 second here. We need to also mention that stakeholder satisfaction is there should be at least key project objective, and it becomes more and more prevalent within projects that stakeholder satisfaction is a project metric. An example of this is the current project to develop the new Leaving Certificate curriculum. Stakeholders in this project include teachers, students, third level education institutions, parents, local community. And the way the new curriculum for the Leaving Certificate is going to be developed is such that the new curriculum will satisfy the requirements of all the stakeholders, and that stakeholders will actually be satisfied with it and will have some metrics for it. We need to recognize that stakeholder management and stakeholder engagement is a process that continues throughout the life cycle of the project. It's not done at the beginning. It should be continually done throughout the project because stakeholders may change in how they relate to the project and how they what do they expect from the project. So that's actually there is a question about this presentation models Zoom recording. I spoke about stakeholder management as an iterative process, so it has to be done throughout the project lifecycle, just so that the stakeholders can be engaged with as the project progresses, their input taken into consideration, and project success ensured. So stakeholders may include many of the groups of individuals and organizations, project team members, organizational stakeholders, the suppliers to the organization, people from organizations around environmentalism, around the legal lobbying, people involved in finance, people who finance the project and finance the project and finance the endeavor and the project deliverables, so the finances. And I guess what I need to highlight here is that team members who are stakeholders themselves should also be included and participate in stakeholders' activities, and in such a way that they accept them. There are some stakeholders who will have a higher impact on the project than other stakeholders, and those stakeholders should be prioritized in engagement and engaged as early as possible, just so that um, they can have their input into the project activities, and their input is taken on board, processed, and possibly included, especially if those stakeholders have a lot of power and a lot of interest. And we need to consider the positive and negative engagement from the stakeholders in case of any project reputation loss. So I mentioned already that stakeholders are any personal or body of people, like an organization, who can affect the outcome or be affected by the outcome. So in this little graphic, we are seeing some of the examples of the relationships between stakeholders groups and the project. So arrow towards means that the stakeholder affects. Arrow outwards mean that stakeholder is affected by the project outcome. So from this should be clear that groups of people are affected and affect the project, and those groups of people could involve project team members. Regulatory bodies affect the project directly. Um, Environmental bodies affect the project but are not really affected unless it's a civil engineering project, then it will be a little bit different. Vendors are affected and affect the project, financial institutions in a similar way. And I suppose it's important to recognize in this case that in function of project manager and project management itself is more about dealing with people and dealing with different groups of stakeholders. And not every one of the stakeholders is as important as others. So it would be important for project managers to focus their effort to contribute to the project success. In this knowledge area, in the stakeholder management, the key and the most important outcome here is identifying the stakeholders, prioritizing the stakeholders to know who are the most important players, and then working with the team members and with stakeholders in developing a strategy uh, in such a way that the stakeholders can be engaged and managed so that the project can achieve its desired objective. And an important part of this process is the interpersonal skills, which should be present within the project team and critically within the project manager. So the processes, there aren't many processes really. There are four only. We're going to identify the stakeholders, plan for the engagement with the stakeholders. We're going to manage the engagement and then monitor engagement. So four processes. So this is nice and short area, but super important for the project success. A little bit more detailed look at the project inputs, outputs, and tools and techniques is listed in this slide, but we're going to look at them all individually. And there are four processes. The first one, the identify stakeholders. To identify stakeholders is present within the initiation group, and this is the second, only one of two processes that are within the initiation group. First one is the prepare project charter, and the second one is identify stakeholders. Once stakeholders are identified within the planning process group, we're going to plan for stakeholder engagement. Within the execution process group, we're going to manage the stakeholder engagement, and then within monitoring and controlling, we're going to monitor that engagement. And there is no activity or no processes within this knowledge area that belong to closing process group. So the first one and the most important one by far is to identify the project stakeholders. Now, if this isn't done with due diligence, the result from the downstream processes within this knowledge area would not be good either. So identifying the stakeholders is critical for this particular process. So within this process, we pretty much identify every single stakeholder of the project, and then we characterize and categorize those stakeholders so that the people that we identified can be prioritized for engagement. Once we produce that list, the list becomes the stakeholder register, and it should include clearly defined high priority stakeholders. Again, I'm going to underline the focused engagement. We want to focus it in such a way that those who have high interest in the project are going to be prioritized for engagement. But critically, critically, we have to identify the stakeholders that are involved in the process. Now, it's not done. It's not done only once. It's not done just at the very beginning. The very beginning is the critical phase where identifying stakeholders is going to have a positive downstream effect. But as the project evolves and progresses through the um, and moves through the progressive elaboration, new stakeholders might be identified or become apparent, or old stakeholders might change their relationship to the project so that the previous um, prioritization of the stakeholders do not apply anymore. The prior prioritizations become invalid. So let's see what goes into this process. 7 inputs including project charter, some business documents, the project management plan, documents for the project. There will be also some agreements, enterprise environmental factors, and OPAs. I'll mention those in a few minutes. So the purpose of the project chart within this process is to, first of all, provide the overall scope of the project, and that scope itself can be used to identify the relevant stakeholders. So scope is going to indicate to us who the stakeholders may be. Besides and outside of that, the charter itself should contain a list of the high-level stakeholders, and that list can also be used for this process and also act as an input towards identifying stakeholders at a little bit higher resolution. Um, so the next input into this process would be business documents, and again, business documents like business case, which might list the initial stakeholders of the project and the business objectives. Our benefits management plan, which should identify how the strategic objective of the project is going to be achieved, and who would be the stakeholders who would help in realizing the strategic objectives of the project success. The project management plan will contain two critical documents. All the plans that uh, might be contributing towards stakeholder engagement, identifying stakeholders. But the two key is the communication management plan, which will help in figuring out how the communication is going to be identified within the stakeholder list, and also the stakeholder engagement plan, which is going to help in how to identify stakeholders, provide maybe some input into the methodology, but also further down the road will help us in developing strategies for um, stakeholder dealing with the stakeholders. The change log might record changes of the stakeholder, especially if the interest and importance of each of the stakeholder, the power and the interest of the stakeholder changes. The issue log should be kept so that any issues raised by each of the stakeholders are addressed and kept track of to understand whether they are still open or not. And then the requirement documentations should help us in identifying the stakeholders from the list of the requirement produced during the development of the project scope. It's a kind of two-direction relationship where the requirements help us identify the scope, and then knowledge of the stakeholders help us identify the possible stakeholders. We also need to be cognizant that agreements might be an important input, because agreements will be made with certain stakeholders, people who might have interest in the project, be influenced or affected by the project success, and also affect the project success themselves. So it would be important that those agreements are an input into this process. For the enterprise environmental factors, we need to be cognizant of the things like customs within a given localization, whether the project work is going to be carried out along different geographical locations, which will in itself provide an expanded list of stakeholders. We need to be aware of the governmental regulations and are the relevant regulatory bodies, and so on. Any of those factors might contribute to the correct identification of the project stakeholders. And organizational process assets should contain things like stakeholder prioritization grids, so tools for prioritizing stakeholders, list of stakeholders from previous projects, and if a company is within a reasonably contained line of business, the stakeholders should likely repeat themselves for different projects that the company might have. Um, the stakeholder register templates and lessons learned from previous projects, which might contribute again to a successful identification of the relevant project stakeholders. So these are the inputs. Moving on towards tools and techniques. Excuse me. Essentially, for the expert judgment, we need to identify individuals with knowledge, which should help us to identify and then identify the stakeholders and understand their interests, so that we can prioritize them for engagement. So anyone or any group of people who can help with prioritization and identification of stakeholders, people like senior managers, project sponsors, project management office might have an input into this case, or even project managers and leaders could be helpful. Useful a useful thing for a set of tools for this process should include some data gathering, things like questionnaires or surveys or brainstorming or brainwriting. And again, the reason for data gathering in this particular process is to identify as many stakeholders as possible and understand um, their interest in the project, and possibly have a little bit of a view into their power over the project. So then we're also going to carry out some data analysis, and primary technique for this process is the stakeholder analysis. And the stakeholder analysis is a technique that helps to identify every single stakeholder, and then prioritize the stakeholders based on various parameters. So in this process, step one would be to identify the possible stakeholders from various inputs to the process. And then for all the possible stakeholders, we would try to identify any kind of influence or impact or power or fear, or their views of how the project is going to be affecting them. And I suppose the larger the list at this stage, the better, because it means that most of the important or relevant stakeholders have been identified. Um, once we have this list, we can try to prioritize the stakeholders. So in this, the second step, the stakeholders from the previous list would be arranged in order of priority for engagement, using some sort of a grid tool. The most popular one being the power versus interest, which we will talk about in a short while. So, we want to figure out who are the people who can impact the outcome of the project, and who will be impacted by the outcome of the project. So those two dimensions are the power and the interest, and the grid can be produced. We're also going to represent the data in various ways for this project. So once we represent the data is the data representation techniques should help us in clearly seeing who are the important and relevant stakeholders. So the power, the interest grid, or other grids that display how the stakeholders are array within a project, or who are the important ones. These are the data representation tools. Stakeholder Cube, which is a slightly improved version of the grid model, because it permits a multi-dimensional analysis, or rather including 3 dimensions, not just power and interest, but also others. We also have the salience model, which includes aspects of a stakeholder like the power, the urgency of the interest, and their proximity to the project, especially useful for complex relationships. And we have a thing called direction of influence, which is essentially a direction in which the project manager would have to act on the different groups of stakeholders. So, for example, senior managers who cannot who cannot who can affect the project from the point of view of their authority, and their higher positions within the organization would be called an upward direction of influence, because the project manager would have to influence those who are higher up in the hierarchy than him. There is also a downward direction and sideways, and so I'll have a little diagram that kind of explains it in a little while. And we're also going to be using a lot of meetings to identify the stakeholders, prioritize, and represent the stakeholders on the grid. So, what this really boils down to is something like this. The first stage, of this process is identifying the stakeholders. Then the second stage of this process is really finding out, figuring out, understanding what are the interests of the stakeholders, what is the power that stakeholders might have, or in other words, how are they affected by the project, or how can they affect the how can they stakeholders affect the project. So let's say this is an example of a project. Let's say that the organization is looking at getting a new office building. So a lot of stakeholders are going to be identified. But once those stakeholders are identified, they're going to be placed and the power interest grid. And the power interest grid will create four categories of stakeholders. So starting with the low power, low interest, and the bottom left corner. So within this category of stakeholder, the stakeholders do not have too much power to affect the project outcome, and they won't be affected to a significant extent by the project outcome themselves. So that's why it's low power, low interest. And the most reasonable way to treat this group of stakeholders is to monitor it lightly, without spending much resources. Another group of stakeholders would have low power but high interest, so they have low opportunity to influence the project outcome, but they will be influenced by the project outcome quite significantly. So for the new office building, staff who are going to be operating in the building are going to be significantly affected by the project outcome, or the office canteen in a similar way. So these stakeholders, they have high interest, so they should be informed to keep them engaged at an appropriate level. Then we have the high power, low interest. So those who have a significant ability to influence the project outcome, but themselves are not really affected very, very much, like regulatory bodies. So maybe you won't be able to get a planning permission for your new office building. So that's why the power is there. You should keep those stakeholders satisfied. Now, finally, you have those with high power and high interest. So those who have significant ability to influence your project outcome. That's the power dimension. And themselves are going to be affected by the project outcome. So that's the high interest. And these stakeholders are the prime group that we are going to be focusing on when developing the stakeholder engagement plan, because these stakeholders we're going to have to manage closely. And based on how the stakeholders are placed within each of the category, we're going to develop different strategies for dealing with them. So for those with low power, low interest, we're going to be fairly indifferent but polite and communicate them only to inform or seek support. And their conflicts with the low power, low interest stakeholders do not need to be resolved. Conflicts don't have to be resolved. Most commonly, they don't have to be resolved for low power, high interest. But those stakeholders have to be informed at some reasonable frequency of communication. Now, the frequency of communication for stakeholders in high power, low interest doesn't necessarily have to be as high as for high interest, but it definitely needs to be a little bit more formal, and you have to really deal with conflicts there quickly. And finally, you have the high power, high interest group, which are the key stakeholders. They need to be informed really, really quickly. You have to act fast to resolve all the conflicts. And those stakeholders should be involved in the project development so that they can help in the identifying the requirements. So another way of identifying the stakeholders is by looking at their power, urgency, and legitimacy, or the proximity to the project. So the higher the power, if they combine all of those three aspects, so the urgency in relation to the project, the legitimacy or the proximity to the project, and the power over the project, then they're becoming the ultimate um, ultimate stakeholder. They exist within the crossroad of all the possible categories, and that's why we're going to create a different strategy for this step. Now we have dangerous stakeholders with high power and high urgency. We have dependent stakeholders with high urgency and high proximity or legitimacy. We have dominant ones with high power and high proximity or high legitimacy. Again, this is just a slightly different way of categorizing the stakeholders. Like, you have stakeholders with high power but no urgency and no legitimacy, or stakeholders with no power, no urgency, but high proximity or high legitimacy. Or you'll have somebody with high urgency but no power and no legitimacy. So that might be the project manager. They'd have some power but not too much. In any case, the way we categorize using this tool is going to have the same impact on how we're going to prioritize the stakeholder engagement in the subsequent processes. And the last but not least, I guess, method of representing the stakeholder engagement is the stakeholder cube, which would use, rather than using two parameters from the parent grid, it would use three parameters. So power would vary from low to high, interest would vary from low to high, and attitude would vary from negative to positive. And stakeholders with positive attitude, positive or high power and high interest could become influential supporters. Stakeholders with negative attitude, high power, high interest could be the ones that we need to be managing fairly closely. And stakeholders with high power, low attitude, and high interest again could become important, or low interest could become important and dangerous for the project, especially if they have high power and negative attitude towards the project. Each of those three or four tools that we just listed contribute to the key output of this process, and I'm going to highlight and emphasize this again. The primary output of this process is identify who the stakeholders are, and critically figure out who are the important stakeholders. And this information is going to be present within stakeholder register. It's the document that contains everything about the stakeholders, and the prioritization classification, prioritization classification that was used there to group them in first place. Might be some additional information about the stakeholders that might be useful further down the road, and planning, communication, and so on. But the primary output from here is to know who the stakeholders are, and what's their interest and the power over the project. So who are the priorities for engagement? We're also going to deal with some change requests, especially if stakeholder analysis suggests that we need to do change project documents, or maybe we need to look at the scope because of some stakeholder relationship to the project. We're going to update some of the project plans. So project stakeholder management plan could be updated. Some of the project documents as well, like the assumption log or the issue log. Additional agreements might come out as an output of this project, and so on. And we're going to update enterprise environmental factors and OPAs from doing this by producing better, newer list of stakeholders, new templates, and so on. An example of a template for a stakeholder register is given here. In the first column on the left, we have the stakeholder. We have their designation, role in the project, what kind of type of the stakeholder are, internal, external, and so on. Type of communication and their expectations and interest. And maybe in expectations and interests, you have high expectation, low expectation, medium, and so on. Interest, high interest. And then you can use this for prioritization of contact. Now, the second process in this knowledge area is planning the stakeholder engagement. So once we know who the stakeholders are, we're going to figure out the strategies for dealing and working with those stakeholders. Uh, for every single stakeholder, we're going to develop stakeholder specific strategies that are going to use how the stakeholders belong to power, influence, or the impact onto the project, so that we can maximize that towards the project success. I know different stakeholders will require different strategies, so we're going to have to be careful here and to keep in mind the objective of this process, or the project stakeholder, the stakeholder engagement itself. The objective, which is improving the relationships, with a view of ensuring um, ensuring the project success. So once we have the stakeholders identified, we're going to treat them in the following manner. Those with high power, high interest, we're going to develop specific strategies for every single one of them. For those with low power, low interest, we're not going to have any specific strategies. For those with high power, low interest, we're going to have a little bit of a diplomacy present for this, and then for those with high interest, low power, we're going to have some specific communicating strategies. In this process, we're going to have 6 inputs, uh, 6 tools and techniques, and then we're going to produce one single output of the project stakeholder engagement plan. So the inputs to this process include project charter, which again is going to contain some meaningful information about the key stakeholders and their relationship to the project, some information about the project scope and project constraints, and so on. And the project management plan is the primary and key input into this process. Um, you know, um, suppose one thing to note is that at the time when this process is being carried out, the project management plan um, might not be fully completed, but whatever is done by the time this process is being done, this process is being completed, project management should be used as an input. So it may contain information like the schedule or the phases of the project, the plan for purchasing, plan for communicating with different stakeholders, some of the risks associated with work or different stakeholders, and so on. And such information can be helpful in deciding who are the key stakeholders for engagement. Um, so we're going to have some project documents that are going to be included over here. And again, things like assumption log, change log, issue log, and uh, activities associated with the specific stakeholders. Any information that can contribute to developing meaningful specific strategies for each of the stakeholders should be used, and also agreements which are going to give us a view on how to deal with vendors, that experts and consultants, that should also be used as an input into this project. We're going to have some enterprise environmental factors, like the structure of our organization, the conditions that are in the market, the cultural differences between different locations in the company, and so on. And we're going to use the the organizational process assets, which can help us to understand how working with different stakeholders uh, developed in the past, and which of the strategies worked, which ones didn't, so that we can avoid those, I guess, for specific types of stakeholders. We're going to deal with 5 tools and techniques for this process. So their expert judgment, gathering of the data analysis, data representation, uh, and meetings. So expert judgment, again, experts in this particular context would be anyone who can help us in carrying out this process best. I know it's kind of a very vague description of what an expert is, but essentially at any time where we're dealing with expert judgment as an input into a process, we need to understand this as knowledge of anybody who can be useful for a given process. So For this particular process, individuals or organizations like sponsors or senior managers, project management officers, or project managers who have done similar projects in the past um, can be useful. People who have good knowledge of interpersonal skills and soft skills could be a valuable input into this process as well. A valuable and important technique for this is benchmarking. We would use benchmarking to understand how best organizations or similar organizations, I guess, in our market deal with their stakeholders, how they handle their stakeholders. And if we understand those practices, we can pretty much copy and paste to our stakeholder management plan, provided that the cultural and the enterprise environmental factors for that allow for that type of copy paste activity. We're going to analyze the data that we produce, the assumptions about our stakeholders, the constraints, and how can we deal with them, because if we understand the constraints in dealing with the stakeholders and the assumptions about the stakeholders, it can contribute to better development of a meaningful engagement plan, a plan that would help us in achieving the desired objective of the stakeholder engagement. So we have to be careful about our assumptions, constraints, and there are some root causes with respect to stakeholder behavior in a given context in a situation. We have to um, represent uh, represent the data. So I'll mention this in a second. Um, and we're also going to carry out some decision making about our stakeholder engagement. So we can be authoritative, we can use voting, we can use any other decision making techniques. So we're going to use some data representation techniques. So mind mapping, which I think is common knowledge on what this is. So for every other stakeholder, we could graphically represent a strategy on what to do with each of the stakeholder in a graphical manner. So a mind map might be a useful output for the assignment. We would have stakeholders and we would mind map their engagement in terms of the communication, information, and so on. The things that we would use to deal with the stakeholders in a given context. We're also going to um, produce a way of representing our engagement with stakeholders called the stakeholder engagement assessment matrix. This is a technique that allows us to represent our current um, current engagement level with a given stakeholder and desired engagement level with a given stakeholder. So possible categories of the engagement include unaware, when obviously stakeholder has no awareness of the project; resistant, where the stakeholder is aware of the project but not very happy about the project results; neutral, self-explanatory; supportive, where they are aware and relatively happy about what project is doing; and also leading, where the stakeholder is actively engaged in achieving project success. So when this analysis is carried out, we produce something like that. So for for stakeholders in high interest, like Arjun Sanskar in this particular example, our current estimated engagement level for this stakeholder with our project is that the stakeholder is supportive, but we want to develop strategies and employ strategies in our stakeholder develop strategies and plan strategies in our stakeholder engagement plan, so that this particular stakeholder's engagement is going to move to leading, so that Arjun Sanskar is going to be actively uh, engaged in project success. Another example is this gentleman here, or this individual here, who are currently unaware, and we want to develop an engagement plan for this particular stakeholder so that they become a leading stakeholder in bringing about project success. And note that if we have a stakeholder who we understand as resistant, we want to get them out from this level of engagement, because this means that they are going to be supportive, well, or at least not against project success. They're not going to be an active impediment. And undoubtedly, we're going to have meetings in order to take those inputs, process those inputs, and produce the outputs for this process. And the key and the only output for this particular process is the stakeholder engagement plan, or stakeholder management plan. So it contains all the strategies for each and every stakeholder that we understand as a stakeholder with high priority for engagement, and the strategies will tell us how to help engage them in the project success, how to deal with them, should we have to deal with them, and how to develop relationships with them. And the strategies are kind of an execution of this transition from one engagement level to another engagement level, uh, from in the stakeholder engagement assessment matrix. Now, I suppose one thing that I might mention here is that the stakeholder engagement or stakeholder management plan should probably remain a relatively private document within a project, because it may have a little bit of unintended effects on some of the stakeholders. If stakeholders understand that they're being actively managed, their resistance might increase. So I would recommend against widely publicizing this document. Anyway, what we're going to have in this document is the current engagement levels, desired engagement levels, how to move from the current to the desired. We're going to have some information on the relevant stakeholders that will provide us with some background about them. We're going to put together some methodology for plan updates. If some specific stakeholders require individually developed strategies for stakeholder engagement, that's also going to be present there, and a couple of other aspects that are going to be present there. But again, this document helps us to understand how to engage uh, with the key stakeholders, uh, and what our desired objective for these engagements are, so that when we engage with the stakeholders, we're bringing about the project success. So now we know who the stakeholders are. We plan for stakeholder engagement. So now we're going to execute and manage the stakeholder engagement. And this is essentially the execution of the stakeholder engagement plan, which is carried out for the benefits of the project, obtained from or achieved by involving stakeholders and influencing the stakeholders for the sake of the project. And the idea here is that we're going to carry out the engagement plan to increase the chances of the success of the project, reduce possibility of conflicts, work towards improved cooperation and coordination, and try to resolve issues and reduce personal problems. So, like within execution, we're going to do that. There are 4 inputs. There are 5 tools and techniques, and there will be 3 outputs from this process, rather. Sorry. So, inputs include project management plan, uh, subcomponents, like communications management plan, self-explanatory. It's going to tell us how to deal with communicating with different contexts. Risk management plan, so some stakeholder specific risks and what are the contingencies and what are the risk responses planned for this risk should it occur. Stakeholder engagement plan, which is the plan that informs the process of engaging with the stakeholders, tells us who the key stakeholders are, what are our expectations for the key stakeholders, and what are the strategies we're going to employ in order to actualize our expectations. And change management plan, which may become important should, as a result of carrying out this process, we have to carry out some changes within the project management plan. We're also going to include project documents needed for the strategic execution of the project management plan, project stakeholder engagement plan, rather. The strategies that we need to execute to get the desired reaction from the stakeholders and to reach the results that we planned earlier for stakeholder engagement. And the things that might be included from the project document list are the change logs, so any changes that arose as a result of the stakeholder engagement execution, issue logs, so any open issues that stakeholders might have with us and that are raised, lessons learned to help us deal with situations that might have occurred in the past or to help us avoid mistakes that might have occurred in the past, and finally stakeholder register, so we actually understand and know who the stakeholders are, what are their uh, what's their priority within the project, and how, and maybe know what are the specific strategies. Tools and techniques, again, expert judgment. So any expert, any person with sufficient knowledge that will help us execute the project engagement plan and project engagement strategy are going to be useful here. So people with knowledge of politics and power structures, or environment and culture of the organization outside, people who have knowledge of techniques that can be used for assessment and execution of the stakeholder engagement, people, and critically, I think, again, I'm going to highlight this because I think it's the most important aspect here, people with communications, good knowledge of communications methods and strategies and how to execute them to obtain desired project success, people with knowledge of the characteristics of stakeholders and how those characteristics can be leveraged in order to achieve the project success and the desired outcome of the stakeholder engagement, and people with knowledge of managing the requirements that stakeholders might produce, how to manage vendors who are also stakeholders within a project, and people who might be useful to deal with change arising as a result of stakeholder engagement activities. We're going to have to um, employ effective communication skills in order to be able to achieve desired project outcomes, process outcomes for this particular process. The most important one of the, I think the most important one of the most important technique here would be feedback. Giving feedback to our stakeholders and see whether our strategy, getting feedback from the stakeholders to see if our strategy is working or not. That feedback from the stakeholder can be direct or indirect, and it could be obtained through casual conversation, through formal meetings, through just talking to people and understanding their current relationships to the project. I suppose getting the feedback regularly would be useful in understanding whether our strategies, the ones that we planned in the previous process, whether those strategies are actually effective and they're achieving the goals that we set for those strategies. Again, for this process, we are going to have a significant set of interpersonal skills and team skills. So skills that help us develop relationships, develop connections with people around us. Project manager probably has to be almost a little bit of a virtuoso in the interpersonal and team skills. The better they are at the interpersonal and team skills, I think the higher the likelihood of their high performance as a project manager, and achieving project success. So the interpersonal team skills there are a lot of them, but and it's not a limited list. Building trust, understanding body language of individuals, being empathetic towards individuals so that we can understand their mental states and respond to those mental states accordingly. Influencing while being, I suppose, being humane to other people without coercion. So influencing through leadership, influencing through argumentation, and so on. Um, dealing with conflicts and how to turn conflicts into learning opportunities and opportunities for strengthening relationships. Conflicts usually indicate that parties in conflict have um, a view of reality that's not in agreement. So their respective views of reality do not agree, and because of this, conflict presents learning opportunities for either party, because it indicates that at least one of the parties have a view of the reality that's not true. There is a gentleman called Ray Dalio who produced a number of books and articles on this topic that I definitely recommend. Active listening, which is a fundamental skill for communication and really at the basis of everything else. Once an individual feels listened to and heard, they are much more likely to engage with you. They might be more susceptible to your influence. They essentially they will be more likely to help you produce the outcomes that you desire. Emotional intelligence, which is a term coined by actually a journalist, I think, not a psychologist, and it's not really scientifically valid. But I think an emotional intelligence indicates the ability to understand others' emotions and respond to others' emotions accordingly, so that they feel like their emotions are seen, heard, and approved of. Again, I'm not a big fan of emotional intelligence as a concept. It's not scientifically valid. There doesn't seem to be literature that supports existence of it, even though in popular culture it's it's super rad and really popular. So yeah, and negotiating so that we can bring our desires to the table, see the desires and needs of another party, and then by the process of negotiating bring something like a collaborative solution. Again, collaborative is better than compromising, but not always possible.
Wouldn't emotional intelligence just be another way of saying empathy?
Yeah, I kind of see it like that. There is a connection between empathy and the big five traits. So something like emotional stability and ability to deal with negative emotions that relates to emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence takes some aspects from those traits that people have, but that's pretty much it, really. Our ability to see others' emotions and respond to them accordingly. Um, Great. Like I don't want to sound cynical, but that's how I see it. Like, this is really catchy thing, and a great way to produce books and seminars, but not really scientifically valid. um, there aren't really many reproducible papers that test existence of emotional intelligence, which I find interesting. Manipulation is a useful thing to think about, but I kind of prefer influencing. Realistically speaking, there isn't anything wrong with manipulating anybody. Like, I mean, if manipulating somebody brings you towards the objective that you both have, or at least the objective that doesn't lead to any of the parties suffering, then nothing wrong with manipulating. But influencing, I like better for the same idea. Mm. So we have I suppose, another two tools and techniques. So the ground rules, which are going to, I suppose, really help with the existence of the project team, and maybe even some of the outside stakeholders. So once you kind of set the rules for expected behavior and the kind of language that is accepted within a team, and the kind of culture that is accepted within a team or within the organization, and everybody understands what those rules are, even if those rules are fairly informal or formal, doesn't really matter, as long as we have understanding of what those rules are. Like, really improves working with stakeholders. There are some boundaries within which we can operate. We don't have to worry about operating outside of those boundaries, especially if the outside of the boundaries is the area where dragons be. So, areas where conflicts can arise easily. So having ground rules is really helpful. And obviously, meetings, because nothing useful has ever been done without a meeting being carried out plan it, organize it, or some other such. So yeah. Um, as an output from this process, we're going to produce things like change requests, because obviously some changes may be suggested to any of the baselines, so schedule baseline, cost baseline, or scope baseline, as a result of the stakeholder engagement, and those changes need to be approved through the process of integrated change control, which we have already covered. But the change request uh, is the output from this process that is going to lead to this change being approved or rejected and carried out. We may have to update some of the project plans, like communications or stakeholder management plan, depending on how the stakeholder engagement is being carried out. And last but not least, we can expect that some of the documents will have to be updated as well. So change log if the change request had been raised, so that every change requested is logged and then tracked. Issues, should there be any issues, and whether they're open, whether there is any response to those issues, what that response was, and so on. And finally, updates to stakeholder register if there are required based upon the result of this project. And finally, as we're executing something, we're doing something, we need to be monitoring it so that we know whether what we're doing works. So the purpose of the monitoring stakeholder engagement is to check the effectiveness of the stakeholder management plan. And if we need to some alterations and adaptations, if the stakeholder management plan is not working, we're going to know this as a result of this process, and then we can uh, I suppose we can deal with it. We can deal with any variances. So we're going to maintain and increase the effectiveness of our stakeholder engagement. Anything that gets measured gets improved. So if we're measuring and monitor our stakeholder engagement, we're going to be able to improve it, which is a nice thing. Five inputs, five inputs, six tools and techniques, and four outputs. Within those inputs, we're going to have the project management plan components, specifically the resource management plan, so that how the resources are available within a given project context. People on the different activities are going to be available at different stages or different times. So the understanding that might be important for monitoring and controlling stakeholder engagement. Resources for a project are stakeholders. Communications management plan, so that we understand how we should be communicating and we can compare against the plan. Stakeholder engagement plan, so that we know what our baseline for the stakeholder engagement is, and so that we can actually turn our monitoring into something that's useful. And then we're going to input some of the project documents, which would let us know what is happening in the project as far as the stakeholders are concerned. So issue log, so from the previous processes, we should have an idea on how many issues are being reported and raised, and which of the issues are still open. And that's kind of a good indication of the success of the stakeholder management plan and execution of the stakeholder strategies. The lessons learned register, which is going to again contribute to information about what went down in the past and how it was dealt with. Risk registers to identify stakeholder specific risk factors, and the stakeholder register, which is obviously going to list the stakeholders, their priority, their importance for the project, and maybe some of the strategies for the engagement. We're also going to have work performance data, which is essentially raw information that's collected as the project is being carried out, and that we're going to analyze during this process and produce some meaningful information. So, like the work performance data could contain how much work was completed, any finished times, finished dates of works and phases, numbers of change requests, numbers of issues, details of the stakeholder engagement, and so on and so forth. Anything that informs us about the current, the ongoing status of the project, that can then be used to produce some meaningful information would be considered the work performance data. And obviously, EFs and OPAs that had been spoken about when we were talking about monitoring and controlling process work uh, 2 lectures ago. Now, to carry out this process, we're going to use data analysis, decision making, some data representation, and communication skills. So, and also interpersonal and team skills. Um, as far as data analysis is concerned, we're going to have to understand alternatives. What are the alternatives that we can use for engaging with the stakeholders if the original uh, plan is not working? So, what are the options to respond to variances? The variance means that uh, things are not going as the plan suggests they should be. So that's variance from the baseline, and we have to figure out the alternatives might bear fruit that we expected. Root cause analysis to understand the underlying reasons for why the stakeholders are not behaving in a way that the engagement plan suggested they would, and then if we understand the root causes, we can respond to them accordingly. This would help to retrofit the engagement plan and make it more practical. And then again, we can analyze the stakeholders yet again, as we did in the beginning, so that we understand whether the stakeholder priority changed. Excuse me. The project goes through life cycles, and new stakeholders become known, as well as the priority of the old stakeholders changes. So if we analyze stakeholders as we go through the process of monitoring the stakeholder engagement, we can reprioritize our engagement. We can move resources to things that are important rather than dealing with things that had been important but aren't now, so that we can keep our engagement plan up to date and practical and relevant. We're going to have to make some decisions around the stakeholder prioritization and engagement techniques. Whether we're going to change them or retrofit them or continue and so on. So in order to that, we'll need to maybe make some decisions, things like voting, decision techniques like voting, like authoritative decision-making processes, like cluster decision-making processes, or multi-criterion decision analysis, like analytic hierarchy process, where we identify criteria for decision making for each, and we score each of the alternatives based on the criteria, and then we compare using an algorithm between alternatives to produce an ordered list of the alternatives ordered list of the alternatives, where the first uh, alternative on the list is the one that satisfies our criteria to the highest possible degree, based on the criteria importance as well. So another way, which is much simpler than the analytical hierarchy process, and the analytical hierarchy process actually has a very, very nice article on Wikipedia on how it's carried out. Um, so I definitely recommend this as a kind of light bedtime reading. But it's a very nice and very neat decision making technique. Another one which is much simpler than that is just simple scoring methods, where you come up with a set of alternatives, which in this case are stakeholders. For each of the stakeholders, we are going to come up with some criteria and give the criteria a relative weight. So in this case, let's say 3 means that it's medium weight, 5 means that it's highly weighted criteria, leadership, a little bit lower. And for each of the criteria, we're going to produce a score from 1 to 5, or whatever the scoring method. Some organizations go from 1 to 9 to produce a score, and then based out of the score, we're going to identify the most suitable alternative, which in this case I think is this one with the highest possible score, or maybe it's the lowest possible score. I don't know. It depends on whatever the table was intended to show. That will always be apparent at the beginning of the multi criteria or the simple scoring method. Um, but the whole purpose of doing this is so that we identify the alternative that's most suitable one, and we can make a decision based on this. based on this method. We're going to continue with tools and techniques through interpersonal and team skills, and I think I mentioned communication skills previously. But for the interpersonal and key skills, I mentioned active listening previously, but I think I will mention it again and highlight it because it's again a technique that will help to reduce misunderstanding and critically make the person we're talking to feel listened to and heard. And there is nothing more valuable for a human being than make other human beings feel listened to and heard. It really improves the relationship between two individuals, and through that helps with achieving our objectives. I mean, like if we have a good relationship with a person, that person is going to be much better motivated and much more motivated to work towards the goal that we have than they would be if they didn't have that relationship with us. So that's something that that would be should become important. Cultural awareness that helps us communicate us meaningfully with stakeholders from diverse backgrounds, leadership, and dealing with people and showing them our care and attention for the project and our desire to drive to the project success. Networking, which would help us our expand our relationships, include more people into our relationships, and provide us with additional resources for achieving the project success. Political awareness, which would help us decide on the most suitable strategy given given a context like functions, places within hierarchies, locations in regions where we talk to people, and other more delicate aspects like sex and gender, like people's races, like people's culture, their backgrounds, and so on. So things that might become important in how we communicate to people, so that we don't commit uh, mistakes while we're communicating. And obviously meetings, because nothing important has ever been done without meetings being done. And again, in this process, we just want to know how are things going. And as an output, we're going to create. I suppose we're going to create as information on how are things going, which work performance information, or which would contain status of stakeholder engagement, level of support, or level of engagement from each of the stakeholders, issues with the stakeholders, conflict about aspects of the projects and the stake with the project and the stakeholders. If there's any important changes to the list of stakeholders, that will also become a list, become an output of this project. So any information that can be used for monitoring, controlling project work is work performance information. We might update project plan, the resource management plan, depending on how the resources fit to our updated stakeholder engagement. We might have to update communications management plan, and again stakeholder management plan. Should it become apparent that stakeholders changed in their importance for the project. We're going to continue update the issue log and the lessons learned risk register and stakeholder register. And once we finished with this project, with this process, we have finished with the knowledge area of the project stakeholder management. So right now I'm going to stop the recording.